Look, if a foreign country managed to kill 80,000 Americans in a single year, we wouldn't be debating whether it counts as aggression. We'd be debating how many carrier groups it takes to make the point. And yet, that's basically where we are with drug deaths. The United States government's provisional estimate for 2024 was 80,391 overdose deaths. And that was a big decline from 2023's 110,000. Good news is we're down. Bad news is we're down from a catastrophic number, and a catastrophic number is still catastrophic. Now, let me ask you the real question. If a hostile power smuggled a toxin into the United States that killed tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, would you call that a public health crisis, or would you call it war by other means? Because warfare isn't just tanks rolling across the border anymore. It's cyber, it's supply chains, it's human trafficking, it's other types of operations, and it's absolutely narcotics, especially when a state is at the helm of sheltering, enabling, or profiting from the networks that push poison into the United States. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm talking about Venezuela. Tonight, I'm going to lay out the case, moral, political, and strategic, for why targeting the Venezuelan regime and its enabling apparatus can be justified, and why pretending this is just a crime is the kind of category error that gets a lot of Americans buried and doesn't protect our country. And in a minute, I'm going to get very specific dates, designations, indictments, and what the law actually says. Because if we're going to talk about conflict, we're not doing it with vibes, we're doing it with receipts. Let's start with the lit fuse. I'm federal criminal defense attorney Ron Chapman, former Marine Corps judge advocate. I know about warfare, I know about targeting, and I'm going to give you the scoop on Venezuela. President Trump announced what he called a total blockade, sanctioning oil tankers, preventing them from entering or leaving Venezuela. He tied this to allegations of terrorism, drug smuggling, human trafficking, and asset theft, and even used the phrase foreign terrorist organization in describing the Venezuelan regime. Critics immediately called it an unauthorized act of war, and the legal basis and implementation details described were relatively unclear. Trump could have been a lot more clear about this. Now, I can already hear the pearl clutching from the mostly peaceful narcotics crowd. Ron, a blockade is provocative. This is a war powers violation. Sure, I get what you're trying to say, but here's the part nobody wants to say out loud because it makes the whole debate slightly uncomfortable. The regime's revenue stream and the criminal ecosystem are intertwined. Venezuela's economy has been heavily dependent on oil exports, and analysts warn that a blockade could create a severe economic impact, potentially including inflation and migration pressure. So why would a US president choose that lever to pull on? Well, because in the administration's view, Venezuela isn't just a dysfunctional petro state. It's being treated as a platform, a place where violent transnational organizations can operate with political protection. Think South America's Afghanistan. And here's where the story gets legally and strategically very interesting. The Trump administration didn't just talk tough, it escalated the framing. Cartels and transnational gangs are being treated more like terror entities these days than like criminals, and that's exactly what Trump's voters wanted when they put him in office. In February 2025, the US State Department designated several major transnational criminal organizations, including Tren de Aragua, as foreign terrorist organizations and specially designed global terrorists, putting them on par with the Taliban. The Treasury followed with sanctions, describing Tren de Aragua as violent organizations originating in Venezuela, operating in multiple countries, engaging in crime. Then, in November 2025, the State Department announced its intent to designate Venezuela's so-called Cartel de las Solas, designate as a foreign terrorist organization. Now, we can argue about politics all day, but when the US government starts using terrorism tool sets, FTO, and SDGT designations, it's not just semantics. It signals a doctrinal shift. These networks are not being treated as ordinary organized crime, but as strategic threats against the United States. Why? Because of the tens of thousands of Americans that die as a result. Now, this leads to certain questions. What does the law say when a threat isn't a uniformed army, but a cross border killing machine using chemicals? International law starts with a hard rule. Article 2, Section 4 of the UN Charter says states must refrain from threats or use of force against another state's territory, integrity, or political independence. Then comes the exception everyone knows about, but few people read Article 51, which recognizes the inherent right of individual or collective self defense if an armed attack occurs until the Security Council acts. So the fight becomes this: what counts as an armed attack? If it's missiles, easy. If it's militants crossing a border, easy. If it's a cartel pipeline that kills Americans by the tens of thousands and a state is accused of enabling it, welcome to the modern argument. Now, let me be very careful and very honest. Claiming drug trafficking itself equals an armed attack under Article 51 is not some settled, universally agreed upon doctrine. It's definitely an argument, but it's a serious one, a serious argument. There's also an entire debate about whether a state can use force in another state's territory against non state actors, such as Trinidad when the territorial state is unable or unwilling to deal with the threat. Scholars debate it, critics reject it, proponents embrace it, MSNBC hates it, but there's still a pretty good argument post 9/11 that this should be appropriate. Why does it matter? Because if you're going to justify force, you need a theory that doesn't sound like we're big, so we do what we want and kick other people out of the sandbox. This isn't Monroe Doctrine 2.0. Conservatives should hate that theory. I certainly do. But here's the real position. If we're going to talk about targeting Venezuela, the case is strongest when we frame it narrowly and legally, not just as a joyride for regime change or long term conflict, but as a defensive operation against an ecosystem that is accused of enabling strategic harm by funneling drugs and engaging in terroristic activity. And before anyone says, but Ron, this is just a crime, let's talk about the body count and the market reality. The US saw 110,037 overdose deaths in 2023, 80,391 in 2024. That's not a bad year. That's a national emergency year after year. Families are torn apart. Globally, cocaine production is not shrinking. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime said cocaine production rose to 3,708 tons in 2023, up 34% from 2022, with global seizures hitting a record 2,275 tons and estimated users reaching 25 million in 2023. The translation of all of that is the supply is huge, the money is huge. And as we start to engage in the war on fentanyl and prevent that from leaking into our borders, there's a lot that we need to do about cocaine. US interdiction numbers tell you what kind of volumes we're dealing with. The Coast Guard said it seized nearly 510,000 pounds of cocaine headed to the United States in FY 2025, the largest amount in service history, and compared it to 193 million potentially lethal doses using a 1.2 gram measure. Joint Interagency Task Force South reported supporting disruption of 402 metric tons of cocaine. That stuff can be laced with fentanyl too, so it's a very big threat. If you're wondering whether this is real, yes, it's very real. We are intercepting industrial quantities of poison heading for the United States. Let's not sugarcoat this or cocaine coat it. Now, at this point, some will always throw the objection, and I want to address it head on because it matters from a credibility standpoint. Is Venezuela actually the main route for drugs into the United States? Some people disagree with that. A fair number of experts and analysts argue Venezuela plays only a minor role in that specific flow of drugs that end up in the United States, especially compared with routes through Mexico. That point is often made regarding fentanyl in particular, where Mexico-based networks dominate the United States supply. So no, Venezuela is not as big as some of those Mexican routes, but why is it important? Venezuela is the single source of American overdose crisis related to cocaine. True, but here's why it's important. It is the only state sponsor of this drug activity down south. So here's what I'm saying. Venezuela matters in three ways that make it a legitimate national security target set especially under a border-focused doctrine. First, we have to look at state complicity. This changes the moral equation fundamentally. In March 2020, the US Department of Justice announced narco-terrorism charges against Nicolas Maduro and other Venezuelan officials, alleging corruption, cooperation with traffickers, including allegations connected to the FARC. Whether you agree with every element of that case or not, the US government is formally putting on paper charges against the leader of a nation for drug trafficking, state sponsored drug trafficking leading to harm to people in the United States. And then in 2025, the State Department went further by moving the designated Cartel de las Solas as a foreign terrorist organization, explicitly putting them on the list. This is the language of national security. Designated entity as a foreign terrorist organization, take military action to be able to stop it. We've been doing this for years. Second, Venezuela is formally treated as a significant drug transit country according to US policy. The Congressional Research Service report puts Venezuela on the majors list, which explains the statutory framework for identifying major drug producing and drug transit countries. Venezuela is simply one of the top ones. Now, that list hasn't significantly changed since 2011, but one of the big reasons is because drug trafficking is still growing in these nations. This matters because it's not just a Trump era talking point. It's been embedded in US counter narcotics policies for years. Just because Trump's doing it doesn't mean it's new. Third, the regime is wrapped up in border instability and repression. It can't control its borders enough to keep the drugs in its country and prevent them from coming to the United States. The human consequences of this entire campaign and Venezuela's actions spill across borders. There will be 7.9 million Venezuelan refugees worldwide if something isn't done to ensure that country is safe. And even if you take the Venezuela isn't the main pipeline to the US argument seriously, there's still a case to prevent it from being a major drug smuggling route into the United States. Now, let's bring this back to the specific question. Why target Venezuela as part of a conflict posture to stop drugs penetrating our borders? Here's the simplest framing that I could possibly give you for a US-Venezuela intervention. A government's first job is to protect its citizens. That includes territorial defense, but it also includes defending the population from the modern mass casualty threats, whether they arrive from malware, fentanyl, analogs, cartel logistics, or corrupt facilitation of a foreign regime. And if a foreign regime is accused of operating as a safe harbor for organizations that kill Americans, well, that's what our military is here to protect us from. We can't just say that war is only allowed when people wear nice, crispy uniforms. Which brings me to something the left loves to ignore and the right sometimes forgets. Law matters. If you want a campaign like this to be legitimate and effective, we can't do it like a temper tantrum and march into Venezuela and put a flag pin on the Capitol. That's not how this should go. Under US domestic law, presidents have the power as commander in chief, but Congress also has war powers. Those war powers require reporting to Congress when US forces are introduced into hostile or imminent action. It sets out a 60-day clock where Congress has the ability to give approval and should within 60 days. The action needs to stop if Congress doesn't authorize it. So here's my blunt take. If we're going to treat narco terror networks and state enablers as war-level threats, then we really need Congress to act in this area and authorize a narrow defined mission under an authorization for use of military force. This is how you keep a defensive doctrine from turning into a forever war or a bureaucracy playground or a haven for special interest groups. You want to learn more about special interest groups and how they can be abused? Check out my Hillary Clinton episodes. And if you've ever watched federal power creep, if you've really watched it like I did in Afghanistan, you'll know exactly what I'm saying. It's one of the reasons why I wrote my book, Fight the Feds, because once you give Washington a shiny new authority, it never really just expires, it just metastasizes. And then we end up in a 20-year war in some foreign country. Well, we're going to avoid all that with some limited campaign to prevent drug trafficking from threatening the United States. And honestly, that's exactly what Trump is doing by blowing drug boats out of the water. On one hand, they don't want him to do that. On the other hand, they're afraid of him engaging in a full scale assault on Venezuela. Well, which one is it? Are targeted strikes okay? Are you demanding full scale war, or would you rather he just do nothing? That's the difficult question here. The Associated Press reported that the blockade that now surrounds Venezuela at the time I'm recording this was part of a broader escalation with a naval buildup. The administration's actions drew lots of bipartisan scrutiny, including reports of deaths linked to these maritime incidents, people concerned about air traffic in the area, and a concern that there may be a larger campaign to chase Maduro from power. Reuters also reported on that campaign targeting suspected drug trafficking vessels, with the defense secretary declining to release unedited strike video and noting in congressional briefings and partisan reactions. Reuters reported the strikes as part of a multi month campaign and tied them to a broader strategy. They're trying to make the case that Congress needs to get involved. But these justifications aren't really just one dimensional. It's a counter narcotics, counter trafficking, counter terrorism campaign that's also directed at a larger campaign to chase Maduro from office. No congressional action is necessary at this point. Now, I know some of you are thinking, Ron, isn't this regime change just dressed up as counter narcotics? You may say that, certainly. If a president of a foreign country is doing a bad thingy and we need to stop that bad thingy and that results in regime change, I don't really have too much of a problem with it. And here, the state itself is a protection racket. It is a narco terror racket. It is deeply entrenched in human trafficking and profiting off of that. We shouldn't have too much of an issue with regime change, but that doesn't mean that we need to do it ourselves. The trick here is lawful restraint and clarity. So, what would a morally and strategically defensible approach look like if I was advising a commander in chief, as I advised battalion commanders when I was involved in Afghanistan? Well, we want to avoid a 3-decade project. We need a strategy that prioritizes maritime interdiction, stopping the drugs, intelligence driven targeting of designated entities. Who are the enemies and how can we get at them? Disruption of financing, logistics, and cooperation with regional partners, paired with very explicit congressional authorization and very strict rules of engagement that everybody understands and everybody's clear on. The moral argument has to be honest, not we're saving Venezuela, but we're defending Americans from narcotics while refusing to reward a regime that is engaged in large scale oppression and embezzlement from its people. Because there's a moral reality that we need to look at here, and every American deserves to understand what's going on. But also, every drug trafficking network built on coercion, violence, corruption, stacking bodies needs to be exploited. If we're going to be a country that says human rights matter, then we can't just pick human rights that poll well and human rights that we like, or human rights that oust enemies, or human rights that get our fat cat friends a lot of money. We need to make sure that we take care of human rights for all people, and that starts with people in the United States. And that's where an America First strategy actually has a foothold. Overdose deaths are declining in the United States. That's great. That's real. We want to see that continue. And here, if we have a combination of enforcement, awareness, and public health presence, we can really change that along with this Venezuelan campaign that would tie into a larger strategy. But at the same time, we see global cocaine production and seizures are hitting records, and US maritime interdiction is hitting records, meaning the world's not stopping. So, what does that tell you? It tells you that this isn't a single lever problem. We can't just pull on one thing to make it work. It's a system. Systems don't change because you arrested a guy with a backpack or you engaged in regime change. What we need to do is engage in a larger public health conversation. The moment the US starts talking about blockades and strikes, the blowback begins, the legal challenges, the international condemnation, the propaganda from certain parties. We get that inevitable line from some people who say, this will just make it worse. This will just entrench America in war. Could it? Sure. A blockade could raise a humanitarian crisis. It could escalate tensions. Somebody could do something first, like the Gulf of Tonkin, and we might end up in a situation. Critics could call it an act of war. Congress might demand that they have a say. But right now, we're only involved in a blockade. We'll have to see what happens next. So, what do we do as America? Do we do nothing to stop the drug boats from coming into the United States? Do we do nothing to close the border? Do we do nothing to protect the citizens of the United States? Do we do nothing to keep our national sovereignty? No, it's not that simple. We have to do something. And that something is a limited, targeted, focused campaign into Venezuela that is legally and morally defensible. Now, let's get to the real hot button item, the targeting of drug boats under US and international law. Some people say that the second strike is the worst thing that you could do. Some people say that that amounts to murder. Well, I don't see it that simply. Let's talk about targeting of the drug boats first and foremost. We've designated an entity as a foreign terrorist organization, and those seeking to harm people in the United States are engaged in an active war if the president has deemed action appropriate. We've done so against terrorists. We've done so against foreign actors who may or may not be tied to a state. This isn't something new. So when I see tons of cocaine or tons of drugs or tons of fentanyl laced items screaming towards our border, which could have a detrimental impact on public health and killing kids, I can see that as an act of war. War doesn't always happen with uniforms. Yes, you can target them, and I would have given authorization to do that. Secondary strikes when people are in the water, some people may argue that that's a violation of law. We leave that up to the individual commanders on the ground to determine if the threat still exists based on the rules of engagement. This is not something we usually question based on video happening after the fact, because not everything that is happening on video. For instance, we take a shot at that terrorist who's on top of a building and it looks like they only have a cell phone from the video, but they may very well be calling mortars in on your friends. Video's not the whole story, and anybody who thinks that they can make a decision based on a video they see in the press is absolutely wrong, and they would be dead wrong if they had to make that same choice on the battlefield of today. We give our military commanders the authority to do what they need to do, and we trust them. And if they breach our trust, we take appropriate action. We have a system for this. If the public wants to be outraged, they can only be outraged when they get sufficient information of what's going on. So, do I have a problem with the targeting of these boats once, even twice? Absolutely not, until I have full information. That's what we're supposed to do as American citizens. We have a system of justice that is supposed to work. We take evidence, we hear it, and we move forward and come to a conclusion. We don't make decisions based on sound bites. So here's what we're going to see next for the weeks, months following this episode in Venezuela. We'll see a blockade. Somebody will slip up. There will be some sort of propaganda rally cry from either side arguing that one side attacked the other. We see it every time people get a little bit too close and there's a standoff. It's the pushing and shoving outside of the bar that gets heavier and heavier until somebody finally throws a punch. And that may be what we see. But the trick for the United States is, how do we respond to that punch? How do we ensure that if that punch is thrown, we act in a restrained and appropriate posture? That's going to be important for the United States. That's going to be important for the commanders on the ground. And that's going to be important to keep America safe. Here's what I hope President Trump does. I hope he stays restrained. I hope he limits the intervention to that which specifically helps American citizens, to ensure that we keep our citizens safe without getting embroiled in some spending on a foreign war. For those who criticize Donald Trump for taking this sort of action, I say look at the billions sent over to Ukraine, an empty war based on absolutely nothing that would help the United States or anyone in it. What we really need to do here is engage the threat, take the threat out, and move on to the next one until we keep America safe. I know this episode is a little different, a lot less law, a little bit more targeting and strategy. In the next episode, we're going to get back to our same old, talking about those legal conflicts inside of the United States and the people who threaten us from within.